Thank you all for joining me this afternoon, especially following yesterday's discussion where we introduced part one of a new series of videos that I'm going to be promoting, and that involves texts in the Bible that appear to me and others to explicitly conflict with the teaching of the Trinity, right? So it's basically the best reasons why people like me and others do not believe in the Trinity. The doctrine there are three persons in the one God and that share the nature of the one God co-equally, co-eternally. And so, there's some other obviously attached things that go with it, including the dual nature of Christ. But in terms of the Trinity, in terms of God, right? We're talking about God. When I get to the texts that involve duality, potential duality, or what Trinitarians allege is a dual nature of Christ in a Trinitarian sense, we'll talk about it. But and if it comes up today, fine. But keep in mind, yesterday's show on Galatians 3:20 was very clearly about what? Right? How many persons is God? I had someone comment on the video and say, well, it doesn't mean that God is one person, because the other party to the contract is Israel, right? And that's a lot of people. So I wrote him back, and I was just sort of amazed, right? Even for a Trinitarian, apologetic nut, or somebody who they don't really think about what they're saying. What does Galatians 3:20 say that would contradict that? But God is one, right? Israel may be many, and was, right? We are many in terms of the new covenant. God is one. That's the whole point of me bringing out that text yesterday, that this and other apologetic nuts missed, and started posting misleading comments, and it's like they didn't even hear what I said, right? They didn't even read it. It didn't even get through their head, certainly not into their heart, to show that they were smart and got the sense of it. No, instead of that, it was like, you're a heretic, you've got the wrong this and that. It's just all this vehement hate and anger for what? Because we proved, using Galatians 3:20 as the first part of this new series, that God is one person in contrast to the mediator and the other party involved. That was the whole point. So if you didn't get that, right, if somehow you watched my video once or twice and it didn't dawn on you, or you read Galatians 3:20 once or twice and it didn't occur to you almost immediately that God is one person in comparison to the mediator and the other party, there's nothing I can do for you. I don't think probably there's anything anyone, except of course God, could do for you. You're clearly not capable of reading the text and getting the sense of it. Not as I see it. I understand. Of course, you think the same thing probably about me, right? Your comments show that. But that's why I created these shows. I wanted this series of videos to really give the apologetic nuts, sort of think of it as like a vent, right? So they don't blow everything up. This way they, instead of, just throwing out comments on all my videos, whether or not they apply directly to the video. This way maybe I can herd them into a more appropriately contained series of videos. But it's going to be the same for many of them, right? They're going to come in, they're going to read the text, watch the video, and it's like, okay, it didn't even faze them. You're a heretic. That doesn't mean that. Israel's a party. So why couldn't God be more than one person? Oh, because it says one? Yeah, that was the whole point. And somehow, someone, obviously an adult, right? I mean, they're subscribed to YouTube and commenting on my channel. So we'll assume they're at least, I don't know, probably, I'll assume, I'll give some space here, right? 15, 16, hopefully 18. But the comment reflects such an inability. If it wasn't for the fact I was doing these videos for the sole purpose, really, of containing, of presenting, hopefully useful information, obviously, but also containing some of the resident nuts then I would just say, what's the point, right? You didn't even get that from the text. You had to comment in a way that makes me out to be a heretic because you don't see that it qualifies God as one in that text. There's nothing I can do, right? If you're going to argue that Israel being more than one means that God could be more than one, when the very text at issue says he's one, what can I do, right? It's like with today's text, part 2. If Jesus uses a text, all right, Trinitarian, apologetic nuts, and others, but mainly you apologists, the ones who, instead of doing what you're supposed to do, seek people out in order to create disruption. And we'll try to give you the best possible light and say you're just here because you really care about us, right? You think somehow we're lost, and maybe you think I'm a false teacher and people are going to be misled, right? Because you don't trust them. You don't think they can read the text like you could, and so they need you to mess it up. Well, while you're thinking about all that and all the other apologetic stuff, ask yourself this question. If Jesus teaches that he is a God like the other sons of God, and for that reason can be called God, like they are, then what's wrong with our teaching? We know what's wrong with your teaching, and we'll get to it further later, but what I'm asking you, if that's what Jesus teaches, we're going to get to it right in just a second. Now that we've kind of gone over yesterday's show and some of the unfortunate comments, it's a little, of course, sad, but, because you hope for that people would get the sense of it, right? That's kind of our challenge when we're dealing with presenting publicly any, useful information, especially religious type, because people might not like it. They might stomp on it and reject it in ways when we're like, no, you just don't agree with me and you're overstating your case. And you didn't see that word one there, right? Why are you talking about a party on the other side as if it applies there when it just said one there and not on the other side? You see what I'm saying? It's going to happen again today. You watch. I hope it doesn't, of course. But I'm using I'm using history as a teacher that tells me we've got some nuts, right? And that's okay. I made this series of videos really while as you know, I try to focus on just presenting the truth about Jesus, and treating each other the right way. The apologetic nuts are a little bit of an exception, right? They were given somewhat of an exception by Jesus because he knew they kept pursuing him. He had to deal with them, and a lot of people were confused. So that's okay. But once you clearly present something, right, and they don't even come close, right? They miss like everything, and especially key terms, and you're like, so at that point you have to let them go. There's a certain type. They'll keep coming. We know that, right? I mean, we can't really stop them. Even Paul had demon-possessed people running around after him, right? Yelling, he's a servant of the true God. Of course, they're calling us worse than that, and he had enemies too. And not every one of the nuts is demon-possessed. I'm not saying that. I'm giving examples from the text, what they had to go through. So it shouldn't be much better for us, at least not all the time. We've got to deal with nuts, right? But we're not seeking them out. We're presenting text like in this series of videos, but we're doing that so that people can quickly see what we're talking about, what we believe. So we talked about Galatians 3:20 and how it shows that God is one person. That's clearly what it said and taught. We covered the whole related context, and I believe it was pretty clear unless you just don't see it, right? I can't help beyond reading and explaining the text and showing the qualifiers and what's next. I mean, at some point we just agree or don't, right? And then so it's not appropriate for you or me to just keep arguing with each other. That's what the nuts do, right? They don't stop. Their point is not to try to resolve conflict or issues. But if they are going to expect us to believe in the Trinity, right? For them, the Trinity is the dividing line, one of them. Right? If we don't accept the Trinity, what? We're heretics. We're in a cult. We're not approved Christians, right? It's like the worst. It's like the Watchtower stuff, only they're more open about condemning you, right? They don't have as many pressurizing elements keeping them in check. It's sort of their style to be out and cause a spiritual wreck. Of course, there's a lot of Watchtower nuts too. Yes, there are. We know you. And they'll defend the Watchtower at all costs, right? Just like the Trinitarian nuts. When anything we talk about, like in this series of videos, shows a conflict with their belief in the Bible, they go nuts, right? So that's okay to some extent on these videos, the Bible and the Trinity and conflict videos, right? We don't want people to go insane, right? And some do, right? But I mean, I'll leave some comments I normally wouldn't that are a little bit, just out there, or they don't really connect with anything, or like I said, some person just wrote, you need to read Dr. Morey when it comes to Galatians 3:20. Well, as if I haven't, right? I have no experience with Dr. Morey, and of course he or she doesn't present anything from Morey's or other person's text that would argue against what I talk about in the video. So there's really no point to some of the comments, but I'm trying to let some of the Trinitarians who come here have a little bit more room. I don't want to say to go nuts, right? But to feel like they're making a point, I guess. So don't be surprised if a few more things are there. But if it gets hot and heavy, or if there's like vehement fighting, you're out of here. It doesn't matter who you are, pro this channel or not. That's not appropriate, right? You're not to devolve. You're supposed to be Christians, Trinitarian or non. Okay? So we disagree. We have disagreements that are serious. We're talking about them. So, and right now we're talking about John 10, 33 through 36. We covered yesterday. We kind of filled in some of the gaps because of the comments. And, there still seems to be even a certain lapse with some people that, should know better at this point, right? If you can't see that God is one in Galatians 3:20, like I said before, we disagree, right? Move on. Now let's focus on these texts. So, we're talking about what? We're talking about John 10:30 and its use of gods. John 10:33 through 36 will be our focus text, right? That's what's in the thumbnail. But we're going to read some of the surrounding context. So let's go ahead and pull that up. I'll bring up the NWT, and then what I'll do is, I'll share a few of the other readings from other translations so there's a comparison. But the NWT really fits well in our discussion today, not only because I'm familiar with it and I haven't translated all the texts from this section of John we're going to be considering, but the NWT is different from most modern English texts. And so it's even more appropriate, I believe, to use today. So if you don't like it, as I say, I'm not here to cater to your translation preferences, right? If you have a problem with it, it's up to you to bring it up in discussion appropriately. All right. So let me bring up the text we'll be using today so you can either read along or you can listen as I go through it or read from your own text and translation. John 10. And to start, we'll go ahead and begin. Let's see. I wanted to pick a spot where things have. Let's start. Okay, in verse 22, because I think that gives us a really good connecting point into the subject texts, John 10, 33 through 36. And we'll go a little bit beyond that. But let's start in verse 22. According to the NWT, at that time the festival of dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was wintertime, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. Therefore the Jews encircled him and began to say to him, okay, so you see how things are developing, right? Jesus is at the festival in Jerusalem, in the winter, in the colonnade of Solomon. The Jews, when they see him, come and encircle him. And they begin to say to him, "How long are you to keep our souls in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us outspokenly." Verse 25. Jesus answered them, "I told you, and yet you do not believe," right? It's like I was just talking about with people who don't seem to understand what we just read and what I taught the other day, even though it's just about as simple as it can get, right? I mean, the party that was at issue, God, is qualified by one in comparison to the others. Not in the sense that, that he's qualified as one in other texts, one God the Father, but God is one, right? Whereas the mediator is not a mediator of one. So if he's not one person, that wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't apply to God, right? There is no text which teaches God is three persons. There is a text, Galatians 3:20, and many others. It's just the most significant, I believe. Teaches God is one person. We know that from the statement in Galatians 3:20, the second part, and we know that from the use of the statement in relation to the first part. I went over it all yesterday and earlier in this video. So taking that with us now, we have a clear understanding of God in the scriptures, clearly defined as one person. And not more than one person, because otherwise, again, what's said in relation to the mediator and the people involved wouldn't be right. But he is one person, and so it is correct. Now, if he were more than one person, and Paul taught Galatians 3:20 in a Trinitarian sense, fine. He doesn't. Next, John 10:25. "I told you, and yet you do not believe. The works that I'm doing in the name of my Father, these bear witness about me. But you do not believe, because you are none of my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give them everlasting life." Were the sheep that were following Jesus out engaging the Pharisee and scribal apologetic nuts? No. It was the nuts coming after them, right? What are they doing right here? Encircling him, questioning him about what? What he's already made plain. Sound familiar? Verse 29. "What my Father has given me is something greater than all things, and no one can snatch them out of the hand of the Father. I and the Father are one." Once more, the Jews lifted up stones to stone him. Jesus replied, "I displayed to you many fine works from the Father. For which of those works are you stoning me?" So what does that show? It shows that Jesus doesn't know exactly what it is this time they're coming after him for. Which one of the works is it that aren't even mine, by the way, right? The works from the Father. What my Father has given me. I and the Father are one, which he defines in this sense more specifically or explicitly in John 17, does he not? That they may be one just as you and I are one, in the unity of purpose and thought. He's not talking about them being one in nature as the Trinitarian God. That's not explicit, but let's say it's possible at this point, right? Let's just leave it in there, because it's basically what they see it in relation to, for the most part. I and the Father are one. Of course, he's not speaking to his disciples here, right? He's talking to the Jews. Once more, the Jews lifted up stones to stone him. Verse 22, Jesus replied. Okay, so again, he's saying what? Which work is it now? What is it now? I did these from the Father. What is it now? The Jews answered him, "We're not stoning you for a fine work." Okay, so they hear him. They're coming at him with stones because they're nuts, right? They engaged him. They're ones who are not really following the will of his Father, obviously, but so notice how they are. They encircle him, question him, demand things of him he's already told them about. Then he tells them about what the Father has given him and how no one can snatch that out of the hand of the Father or his hand, right? Verses 28 and 29, namely his sheep, the ones who follow him. And then he says, I and the Father are one. And so really with them in his hand and his Father's hand, it'd be just like John 17, 21 and following, right? One is just as they are one. So it kind of all fits in the same way. Nevertheless, the Jews don't see it that way, right? And even he isn't totally certain at this point what it is that they're trying to stone him about. I did many fine works from the Father. For which of those works are you stoning me? So we had a few apologetic nuts distracting people, and I'm not going to have any of it. So had to remove them from the chat log, and we'll continue to do that, and I'll just edit this whole part out, right? So makes no difference. All right, so he makes it plain that he realizes they want to stone him, but he's not sure really which work it is this time. Which one is it you're coming to me about this time? The Jews answered him, we are stoning you not for a fine work, but for blasphemy. Even because you, although being a man, make yourself a god. Right? This is the NWT. Now, other texts, other translations, let me share a couple of them with you. And you may be reading from some of them as well, but just so you kind of get a sense, this is one of those texts that would be considered somewhat controversial in that NWT differs from most other translations. So, for example, the King James says, the Jews answered him, saying, for a good work we stone thee not, but for blasphemy, and because that thou being a man makest thyself God, capital G-O-D. The New International Version says, because you, a mere man, claim to be God, capital G-O-D. And the New Revised Standard also reads similarly. Now, the New English Bible, I believe, also uses, similar to NWT, either in the main text or in a footnote. And I'm going to argue that in spite of the fact that NWT and translations like the NEB and New English Bible are in the minority, they are absolutely correct when it comes to the translation of this text, John 10:33. Although being a man, we stone you not because of a work, right? You think it's one of the works you did? Not this time. But because of something you said, right? You blasphemed, maybe something he did, but certainly the things he said here trigger them. Because you, although being a man, make yourself a god, or God, right? Capital G-O-D or NWT G-O-D. So which is it? All right. Let's let Jesus answer that question, right? He's the one being accused. Understand, as you I'm sure do if you're following with me and not caught up with the apologetic nuts, right? Remember, that's their purpose. They're here, and whenever they comment, usually it's for the purpose of disruption. They don't have anything left. They're done. And nobody's going to them anymore. Or if they are, they don't care about us. So the apologetic nuts are really sort of, this is why I made this series for them, right? Though it helps establish our views and the reasons why. It also allows, to some extent, a place more for containment of some of our overzealous Trinitarian and other participants. But nonetheless, our goal is going to remain the same, and that is to address these texts and to present what they say, right? So translations we have today, NWT, NEB, NIV, NRS, New Revised Standard, KJV, God or a God. The Jews tell Jesus, we're not going to stone you for something you did, but for blasphemy, because although being a man, you make yourself NWT a God, KJV God. I'm going to argue that what we read next should end the entire discussion when it comes to the translation of John 10:33, and whether or not we need the Trinity when it comes to our worship of the one God. Right? We already know that God is one person, Galatians 3:20. So in what sense can we say that Jesus is God? If Jesus is not that one person, why do so many translations of this text say that the Jews accused him of making himself God? Were they correct? Is that the correct translation? Verse 34, Jesus answered them, answered their accusation that though being a man, he's making himself a God and blaspheming. Jesus answered that and said, is it not written in your law? I said, you are gods. If he called gods those against whom the word of God came, right, the gods of Psalm 82, and I'm going to limit our discussion today to John 10, because we've already talked about Psalm 82. I talked about it in my Sons of God and Pre-Christian Text video, and I discussed specifically the first century and surrounding centuries view, at least in the Dead Sea Scrolls, of Psalm 82 in part 4 of my Michael and Jesus as the Biblical Archangel series. I'll put links to both of those in the description below, or you can just go to the channel playlists on the main page and look for, I guess the topical index would probably be the best place, but at some point later today or tomorrow, I'll put links to both of those Sons of God and Pre-Christian Texts and part 4 of Michael and Jesus as the Biblical Archangel videos, because in those videos I talk a lot more about texts like Psalm 82. All right, so remember, we get various nuts, and their whole purpose is really to disrupt, right? They don't have anything to offer, as I mentioned before. They're pretty much done. And but we nonetheless have to tolerate them to some extent. So I'm spending a little extra time in reading the chat, because I don't want you guys to be subject to the Trinitarian apologetic nut abuse. And I can see that several times they have attempted to, hijack the discussion, promote various, spiritually retarded apologists, and by spiritual retard, as we talked about yesterday, what we're talking about really is the type of people that we focused on earlier in response to my video on Galatians 3:20, who openly commented on the video and stated that God wouldn't have to be one person because the other party, Israel or us, depending on which sense you see the mediator as discussed in that text, was more than one person. So when we talk about spiritually retarded people, we're not talking about people who are, mentally disabled, actual retards. Right? They're a different class of people who can't really help themselves. Spiritually retarded people are those who they really can't stop doing something that doesn't fit the context, right? So if you saw an actual retard out in public, like a real mentally disabled person, sometimes there are people that take them out, right, and show them the outsides and things so that they have a good experience with life, and then so when you see people like that, like if a real mentally disabled person in public, let's say you encountered them while you were out, if they started like yelling at you like a mentally retarded person and arguing with you about things in ways that showed that they weren't really thinking about things seriously, right? They were kind of nuts in that way, in the real retarded way. You wouldn't take them seriously, would you? Right? I mean, you would kind of look to their handlers like, hey, I know this is, actual retard day, and I appreciate that. I'm glad you take people who have mental issues out and help them. But, I don't want them abusing me or whoever I'm with, can you handle them? Or and they probably would already be doing that, right? So, that being the case, if you engage a spiritually retarded person, like a lot of these nuts want to talk about, because they don't have anything else to do, and they're all kind of, retarded in that spiritual sense. Again, not real, actual mentally disabled retards, but using them as kind of a parallel. If you engage a spiritually retarded person, it just looks dumb, right? It just looks like you're retarded, because everyone can see that the reason that person is acting that way is because they're, in the real mentally retarded sense, they're physically disabled. Well, when you see someone who's been debating and arguing for years, and that's all they want to do, right? What did it say about the scribes and Pharisees? What they do to be observed by others, right? So they're always looking to argue, like the ones we're talking about right here, right? And we'll get back to it in a moment. So, since that's the case, when you know you're dealing with the same type of person, spiritual retards, then you have to kind of treat them differently, right? They're not like a normal person in the real world that you can take seriously in that way. You sort of have to let it go and allow them to just deal with it, right? I mean, they have people responsible for them. We just have to let them go and allow them to really, get the best kind of treatment that's going to be helpful for their problem. What does Paul say to Timothy? They have a diseased mind. So we're not going to be able to help some of those kind. They're basically done, right? They've quit. That's why they're coming to us. If they weren't done, if they thought they were right, they wouldn't be arguing with us, right? We confess Jesus Christ. We disagree like these texts show, that we'll get back to John 10 in a moment, but just making sure that the abusive apologetic nuts in the chat don't, create ongoing problems for you folks. So remember, we created this series of videos to serve as sort of an outlet. So I'm going to let it go. I'm going to keep kind of just absorbing the attempts by the nuts for a little bit, and then we'll get back to the text. But I'm sensitive to you people in the chat. I don't want you to have to go through, these different nuts. And I see what it's like, right? I mean, the people watching this video won't know they were there, right? It's like they'll never have spent this time. They're just speaking into the air. But if you're in the chat and if you're watching it like me, all the nuts have joined the show, right? I mean, they have descended they're going to make Flat Earther look like they've lost, that he and his associates have lost their edge in terms of, trolling videos and stuff. Either way, I know you in the chat appreciate what I'm doing, right? So, now that we've pretty much cleansed out most of the nuts, then for now, let's see if we can get back to the text, and you guys do your best to just hold it together, right? We know who we're dealing with. We knew this would happen when they were given a wider path to come in and disrupt, right? What are the people in the text we're reading about now doing? They saw Jesus. He came out in the open, and they encircled him, right? They encircled him and continued to pester him, right? Ply him with questions, be abusive. So we know based on how we're at times treated. We're not doing this to them, right? They're doing it to us, so we can see, okay, there's our parallel right there. They're showing us by their conduct. They're not taking advantage of this opportunity to glorify the Christ, even in their excessive Trinitarian way, right? No, what they're doing is just trying to disrupt the presentation of the text and a discussion of it so that it doesn't show, in their view, the conflict that's involved in this series of videos, right? We want to know. You Trinitarians are this committed to getting involved in our discussions of the Bible and of God and the Christ, right? You are this involved in our discussion in ways. And so you must really, care about this stuff. All right, if you do, then we want to know, like in the first video, Galatians 3:20, why is God one person? Why is God only one person in a text where he could be more than one person if Paul really thought he was? That seems like a legitimate reason to us to believe God is one person, not three. God is clearly defined in that way in the text. So he's not defined alternatively as more than one person. So while God is used of more than one person, that's what we're talking about today, right? So we've talked about how God is one person, best shown by Galatians 3:20. And now we're talking about the best text that shows that God can be applied to more than one person than the God who is one person, the one God the Father being that one person. Today's discussion is meant to show that God can be used for people like Jesus and others, the other sons of God. That's the whole point Jesus is showing, as we'll get back to in a moment. We don't need to invoke the Trinity. We don't need to redefine God to be more than one person and contradict Galatians 3:20, just so we can explain how other persons can be called God when we have a basis for calling others who are sons of God, such as Jesus, God or gods, according to Jesus. Let's go back to it right now. To the text. All right, so we dealt with some of the things we had to deal with. And boy, if you were in the chat today, you had a unique experience, didn't you? So I can't promise that those who rewatch the video, if you see the chat replay, will see the same things, because I had to do high moderation today. So you may have thought a few moments in the discussion I was sort of carrying on. Although I think I sort of stayed in touch with what we're talking about. But it was this, today, I'm okay with it, right? We weathered it. We're going strong because I knew when I prepared these videos, starting with yesterday's, that this would be the time to let it out, right? We're not going to let them hijack the discussion. We'll get some entertainment from them, and, as I said, we'll be a little more loose and involving with our participants, but, we're not going to let them create distractions and make accusations that are, disrespectful, promote different spiritual retarded nuts and people like we've talked about, So again, to before we go back to the text again, as I was saying, you might really meet a mentally disabled person in life. I've seen them, right? I've seen them at amusement parks and other places where they're taken out and they have handlers, people that watch over them, right? Because they can't fully manage society in the same way we can because of a reason. They're mentally disabled, and so it's understandable. We accept that. And then even when they lose it, right, if they engage us out of nowhere and they freak out because sometimes they lose it, they're just not as socially contained at times. That's why they have handlers and they manage them very well. Well, then we sort of give them a pass, right? We should. We don't hold it against them as much. But when you get to a point where you're dealing with spiritual apologetic nuts, then you have to keep that in mind. You have to think about how you would handle a mentally retarded person in real life. And so when you engage a spiritually retarded person who wants to argue with you and they're like nuts, they don't listen to you, right? You could read that God is one person. It even uses the word one in the context of defining how many persons and qualifying God. It won't matter. Right? They're nuts. Right? You got to immediately think of in this case, it'll help you, right? It'll help you, like the way I use a Siamese twin to sort of help explain the analogy of Trinitarians and their metaphysic. When you're dealing with a spiritual retard, You have to think of a mentally retarded person and say, okay, wait a minute. It's not going to look good if I start engaging, these people, because there's a reason they're disabled. Well, spiritually retarded people are spiritually disabled. What does Paul say? They're diseased in the mind. That's spiritually retarded, right? That's mentally affected. There's something wrong with them. They can't stop. And they've been doing this for a long time, right? Like thousands of years. A couple anyway, close to it. So we need to, at least in terms of these videos and some of our discussions, so let's try to give some of the apologetic nuts who are spiritually retarded a pass. Don't engage them, right? Sometimes we may have to if they're just engaging us and we're trying to get to other people. We can either show these videos to show people sometimes go nuts, right? Especially if you're in the chat today. You saw it all, right? So they're showing us what they are. They're showing us what kind of tree they are. They're showing us what kind of fruit they are. Fruits and nuts in the wrong way. All right? They're not acting in a way that is really acceptable for the discussion of whether or not they can help us resolve a conflict, right? Are they going to help us resolve a conflict between their belief and the biblical text or not? Or are they just going to keep bringing up ways that they can try to get attention and have people see them while they go nuts? Right? We're not here to be a part of that. We promote live discussions. We're here, right? If they make good points, we keep them and discuss them in the chat. But we can all see how they're acting right now and why I'm kind of going on and on with it. Because it's really what we're here for in this series of videos. And I want people to feel like there's at least an option to see both where we disagree with Trinitarians in the most explicit and clearest way I can make possible, right? The best text, and we'll get back to the discussion of this one like we talked about in the first video. And if legitimate Trinitarians, who by legitimate I mean people who sincerely believe and they're willing to openly discuss them in a normal way, then we're open to that, right? We're here. But that's not what happens often, right? They act like what we read about in the biblical text, and like we talked about in the Who Is From God video. The apologetic nuts of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, scribes, and others who really were abusive to him and acted inappropriate in so many ways, but were influential so that they affected other people, right? And we have to deal with a little bit of that. But, I'm just taking a look at the chat and stuff. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, here we go. So, they have a lot of tactics and methods. And so, as I said, these videos, although we're going to discuss the text and focus on the clear teaching of the Bible and then what the Trinity teaches, one God, three persons in that one God, who are co-equal, co-eternal, right? No divisions, no confounding of the nature or of the persons, but they're three separate persons, right? And this is not defined in the Bible. This is the Trinity. This is later stuff. But the Bible is very clear. Galatians 3:20, Hebrews 1:3, imprint of God's being. God is one person, right? He's not many, just like the other party to the contract that the Trinitarian didn't understand was the whole point of the video we did as part one. So some of them are nuts, right? We got to kind of just let it out, let it out, and then ban and moderate those who have, just gone off the edge, right? They're not really reasonable. They're more like the actual retards, right? They have a disability, right? We're trying to give them a pass by paralleling them with actual retards and saying, like Paul says, right, they're diseased in the mind. So while we want to help them, we can't, right? So the angels and God are their handlers, and we have to move past them, like I'm going to do now. All right, let's get back to the text. So I had to clean out a lot of stuff, right? You wouldn't believe it, man. You wouldn't believe it if you really saw all the comments that have been made in the chat today, all angling a certain way. But you know, it actually gives me a little bit of joy. I gotta be, I gotta say, it's not as much of a problem as it would be if I were doing another video about another subject. So, all right, but let's get back to the text before we run out of light. Although I always have not the lights in the room. Okay. So I think we're good. They're really able to troll pretty well, though. It's making me feel joy. So let me enjoy it for a moment. So, oh, wait a minute. Here they go. And I don't want to let this become the whole show. Okay, so again, it's kind of entertaining to me. I have to be honest with you. And I'll delete a good part of the joy that I'm getting from the some of the apologetic nuts today. Let's get back to the text. Okay. Here we go. So we were at the point where the Jews accused Jesus of claiming to be what? A god according to NWT, or God according to KJV or the text. Well, Jesus says if he called gods those against whom the word of God came, after quoting the first part of Psalm 82, you are gods. Is it not written, I said you are gods? If he called gods those against whom the word of God came, and yet the scripture cannot be nullified, do you say to me whom the Father sanctified and dispatched into the world, you blaspheme because I said I'm God's son? Right? Because remember, what was he talking about up here? About how the Father had given him what was greater than all things, and no one can snatch them out of his or the Father's hand. And how he and the Father were one. And how he's doing the works in what? The name of his Father. If you don't believe him, believe the works. Why? Because he says that he's doing the works of the Father. The works I'm doing in the name of my Father. So, and then he says down here as well, I displayed to you many fine works from the Father. Everything is to the Father. Just like what? Philippians 2, all glory to the Father. Even after he's exalted and given the name above every name, it's still not to him. How could that be? We'll talk about that text in another video. But back to this one, you can see, but by his claiming to be the Son of the Father, he's quoting Psalm 82 that does what? Calls the other sons of the Father gods. Jesus' own defense against the accusation by the Jews that he claimed to be either God or a god, right? We know it's a god because what? He used a text in his defense that refers to gods, right? He didn't refer to the part that refers to God and claim that he was that God. He referred to others as gods, or actually God referring to them as gods. And then arguing further, verse 35, if he called those against whom God's word came gods, right? The gods over whom God appointed over the nations according the spirits of Belial, according to the text we considered in part 4 of Michael and Jesus as the biblical archangel, right? This is what they believed. It's what the texts teach. If you read the context, and about how they had failed in their duty as gods over the nations, just like the princes of the nations in Daniel who fought against Michael and the other angels, or Gabriel at least, right? Michael was the only one who would fight with him. The Prince of Israel. So here is Jesus being accused of claiming to be a god or God. And then quote a text. I had to deal with another nut. Modify the chat. In response to their accusation, he quotes a text that calls others gods in the plural in response to their accusation that he claimed to be a singular. So that refutes directly Robert M. Bowman Jr.'s claim that we have to use texts that use the singular term for God to parallel the texts involving Jesus that they believe are consistent with the Trinity, which we can do as well, right? With texts like that in Judges and in John 1:18. But here it's Jesus himself arguing exactly as we do that if God can and does in their own law call others gods, the sons of God, how is it that he as the Son of God can't be a God? Right? We know he's not claiming to be God here because he doesn't quote a text in his defense. Well, it could be Isaiah 9:6, any other text, right? Any text but this, because this can only mean one thing. It's okay to call others gods. And that's his whole point. It's even okay for those against whom God's word came to be called gods, because that's what they were, exactly as the Bible shows over and over again regarding the sons of God. They're gods by being sons of God. Okay, this isn't a made-up text. Trinitarian councils and creeds. We didn't have to wait for post-biblical information. The Bible's good enough for us, right? The Bible is enough for us. We don't need the Trinity, right? One person, one God who is one person is good enough for us, the Father. Jesus as the firstborn Son, that's good enough for us. He's not a sinful creation. He's a sinless creation. He's not groaning, other than in the sense in which he took on our sins and carried them with him until death. He's exalted to the right hand of the Father, given every name, and all glory goes through him to God. Right? So when he argues, let's get back to the text, like he does here, he's saying, look, these others are called gods. They're sons of God. I'm God's son. So what is the problem? You don't accept me as God's son. I know that's the problem. But there's no problem with me claiming to be a son of God or a God. God himself in your own law calls the sons of God gods. That's Jesus himself. Now that's not good enough for Trinitarians. There is an explicit conflict with their view of the use of the term God and gods, because Jesus here shows they're both the same when it comes to the sons of God and him. It's okay. And it's not a conflict. You know what is a conflict? The teaching that Jesus is not a God. Because that directly conflicts with this series of texts. Let me just remove a little bit more. We've got a high level of apologetic nuttiness today. And it's not good, but, it's more normal than it otherwise would be. This text proves Jesus is a God, just like John 1:1 does. We'll get to it another time. But this text shows, John 10:33, the only accusation that they could be making, based on him saying that the Father has given him something, and that he's doing the works of the Father in the name of the Father, are okay, is if he's a God who's a son of God, which is exactly what he says right here. I am God's son, because I said I'm God's son. It's okay. Why? The other sons of God are gods, according to God, and he's saying it in a context where he's coming against them for their failure to act as gods over the nations. He sent me into the world. So how could it be wrong when the Son of God, whom God sends into the world, is a God, and those against the sons of God against whom God came are also gods, right? He'd be even more so deserving of that description. And yet they're both given it. That's what Jesus teaches. It is explicitly what he teaches in these texts. He responds to their accusation. You make yourself a god. Isn't it written in your law? You are gods, referring to the sons of God. I'm a son of God, so I'm a god. I'm quoting this text in Psalm 82 to show you that's okay. The sons of God, even the ones spoken of negatively, are gods. I'm not spoken of negatively by the Father. He sent me. So it's even more than okay. Is that not the plain teaching of these texts? The plain teaching of the text which Trinitarians reject and absolutely disgrace by refusing to accept these texts and Jesus' teaching in them as the authority upon which they should base their faith, not doctrines that came about hundreds of years later and which clearly show they have no idea what Jesus was talking about in John 10:33 through 36.